Hello, everyone. Good to be with you again. So we are on session 3 of our Sunday School Quarterly Teachers Intensive. And so now we're picking up the theme of wilderness. This is going to be the third lesson of the first unit, third lesson overall for this upcoming quarter, coming to us from this passage here in Matthew chapter 23. And you'll notice we have several verses there to read, so it covers quite a broad piece of this particular chapter. And if you're familiar with the layout of Matthew's gospel in a way that you can kind of recall some of the places in that particular passage or gospel, such as Matthew 5 through 7, that's the Sermon on the Mount, or particular chapters and parables and whatnot, or miracles that might be housed within them. One of the perhaps more readily recognized blocks would be Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse. And then when you go to Matthew 25, you have 3 parables in that particular chapter that echo the comments of chapter 24. But then when you go to the other side of Matthew 24, Matthew 23, hopefully you're familiar with the idea, or if you're not, that's fine. Of course, go and read and study it before the time comes for you to teach it. But the woe statements that Jesus makes to the Pharisees, which encompasses the entirety of that chapter. So going back to the concept of wilderness, as you've heard me say perhaps in previous intensives, wilderness is a place where the people of the Lord are supposed to be tested by him to learn to rely on him. And of course, with that, it kind of takes on its own moniker as goes how the people respond to those moments of testing and how the Lord speaks to them and who he speaks to them through. And with that, the first bout of wilderness wandering happened to occur when the people had left Egypt and they're going to the land of Canaan to take the inheritance the Lord has promised them. Moses is their guide. Moses is a prophet of the Lord. He speaks directly to Moses and he reveals himself through the spoken word that becomes the written word as the mouth of Moses first speaks, then writes these things, or maybe in some cases reverse order, albeit the Lord has to redress these people and speak harshly to them when they fail in those moments of testing and whatnot. So that becomes a theme that is seen multiple times over in the development of the Old Testament. They are often called back to that wilderness type of setting. And in some cases are even pushed into that wilderness setting as the story develops, especially the times of other prophets. So you see that kind of concept being taken up by guys like Isaiah and Jeremiah, Zephaniah, Ezekiel, and so forth. And so what you're seeing here as portrayed by Matthew in this particular chapter is Jesus seems to be stepping into the vein of all of these prophets. So what I've done here is kind of isolated some prophecies or woe statements being made by these particular prophets. And I'm not doing that to just simply match woe for woe, because that won't work. And then beyond that, not to just simply show you, well, this word is present in the passage of these prophets. And so because Jesus uses it, there must be some significance here. No, I hope to draw some connection between them for you. But with that, I think what you would perhaps better appreciate is if you look at Jesus while he's saying these words and then see as if standing behind him was Isaiah and Jeremiah and Zephaniah and Ezekiel, all these men standing in the streets of Jerusalem, in the temple precincts, in the various villages that surround Jerusalem, in the provinces of Judah, I should say in the territory of Judah and so forth. And they are the ones decrying the word of the Lord to the people, marking them for their sins and calling them back to covenant faithfulness. But in the process, of course, divulging the judgment that God is going to bring to them because of their heinous actions. So there are many of these in a place like Isaiah, but just picking out 2 of chapter 5, which happens to be a place where more of these are concentrated in Isaiah's scroll, where he says, woe to those who add house to house, who join field to field until there's no more room and you are left alone in the land. So, of course, the idea is that whoever this is, they are engulfing the surrounding properties around them into their own. And so with that, they are truly not adding a house to their own or enlarging their own territory. The idea is that as they buy up the parcels of land around them and they own those houses and those fields, they are pushing out the people who once lived there. For whatever the reason or circumstance might be, did they come to possess that particular property. And by virtue of all the land and houses that they own, now they are left alone. Now, I want to immediately draw this to Jesus before I go to the next woe, because Jesus will say the same thing in Matthew 23, verse 14. Some translations may not include this verse because of the fact that older and what is deemed to be more reliable manuscripts may not house this, but there are English translations that still do have it, or at least refer to it in a footnote. So entertaining the idea that this may have actually been said by Jesus, where he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You devour widows' houses, and you make long prayers just for show. This is why you will receive a harsher punishment." How do they devour widows' houses? Well, go back to the story of where Elisha is helping the woman whose entire future was jeopardized by virtue of the fact her husband had left her indebted to a creditor or series of creditors, and that man or those men were coming to actually take her sons and sell them to slavery. Elisha helps the woman by giving her the remedy by virtue of the miracle that God performs. The Pharisees have the same opportunity. They could use from their own stores, as goes the money they have, to help these widows to continue to hobble along and provide care for them, maybe even work to help find a way to sustain them beyond just a few simple handouts. But instead, they find a way to gobble up that widow's property, push that widow out into destitution, whether she's now homeless, or push her off on other family, and then take that property and make it their own, the very thing Isaiah is speaking about. So here you can see Jesus decrying the people of his own generation who are considered to be the faithful shepherds over these people who he says occupies the seat of Moses. But instead of them being benevolent leaders, they are the snakes that Isaiah speaks about in Isaiah 5. Or Isaiah 5, verse 20, where he says, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light, light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Jesus will go on to say in Matthew 23, to the scribes and Pharisees who are hypocrites, they shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, which of course is an act of evil in and of itself. And they think they're doing the right thing. Their act of evil in and of itself is what they are decrying as good, because they think they are keeping people from falling prey to this charlatan who masquerades as the Messiah and has duped people into thinking him as such. And they think they are the righteous stewards of God's kingdom when they are telling people, you should not listen to what this man says, or lay heavy burdens on their shoulders. They've been doing that for generations, but more so now in this particular period, because they are trying to frighten people into rejecting Jesus by virtue of, if you mention this man, call him Messiah, you are going to be ousted out of the synagogue. If you have known information about his known whereabouts and refuse to share it, you will be ousted out of the synagogue. Through these fear tactics, they are working to try to keep people from listening to Jesus, completely tuning out the message of him and his disciples. They don't want to be caught in association with any of them by virtue of those punishments. So then we go to Jeremiah, who in Jeremiah 22 says, woe for the one who builds his palace through unrighteousness, his upstairs rooms through injustice, who makes his neighbor serve without pay and will not give him his wages. Where Jesus will say in Matthew 23, to the scribes and Pharisees, the hypocrites, you clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. So clearly what we should see here is that Jeremiah is decrying these people who bring about the expansion of their own wealth. As he says here, palace, which no doubt he is decrying kings, the descendants of David, for what they've done and the measure of injustice they brought in the land through not being the kind of king that's embodied in Deuteronomy 17, but instead they are being the very kind, the kind and very king that's just like all the kings of the nations around them, who exploit the weak and vulnerable, and of course through heavy taxation and so forth, or through bribes, or through the kind of political posturing and maneuvering that other kings do, and murdering their adversaries who may even be their own family members, and then seize their wealth as part of it, and then again enlarge their palaces. All of this comes through their own sense of greed and self-indulgence. So Jesus here is standing in the vein of Jeremiah. And then, of course, in Jeremiah 23, the very next chapter, he says, woe to the shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of Israel, those who are fleecing them. By scattering the flock, they banish them, and they have not attended to them. Where Jesus will also say in Matthew 23, to these scribes and Pharisees who are so meticulous, as goes, how they want to tie the Lord, because they will even take their powdered spices and they will divide them up into equal shares so that they can give a tenth of the mint, the dill, and the cumin, and yet they've rejected the more weighty matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. So instead of, and yes, through what we saw up here, they are fleecing the flock. But to add to that, what they are also doing here is they are trying to show that they are indeed faithful to the Lord by virtue of tithing everything that they possibly have in their possession, but instead the very thing that they're supposed to be paying attention to are these concepts of justice, mercy, and faithfulness, while not forgetting the others. This doubles back to Jeremiah simply because instead of them shepherding the flock, they are fleecing the flock. They will tithe in this way to make sure they are checking the boxes appropriately, but what they are ultimately failing to do is care for the people of the Lord who cannot care for themselves, which is rightly their job to do if they are going to take on the concept of being the religious and moral leaders of the people, as the prophets before were. In fact, it's in this very passage. Well, I'm about to spoil my thunder or steal my thunder from what I'm about to say. Let me digress for a second. Zephaniah and Ezekiel. Zephaniah says in the 3rd chapter of his scroll, "Woe to the city that is rebellious, defiled, the oppressive city. She has not obeyed. She has not accepted discipline. She has not trusted in the Lord. She has not drawn near to her God." Where Jesus will say to these scribes and Pharisees, "Hypocrites, you are like whitewashed tombs, which appear beautiful on the outside, but inside are full of dead men's bones and every kind of impurity." Impurity symbolizing the idea of rebelliousness and being defiled. By virtue of that, they have become oppressive to the city's inhabitants. And the Pharisees have in the ways that Jesus has already enumerated. They want to adorn themselves and be lauded by other people as being righteous men, when in reality they are as far from God as a dead corpse could be. Or Ezekiel, who says in chapter 24 of his scroll, "Therefore, this is what the Lord God says, woe to the city of bloodshed, the pot that has corrosion in it, and its corrosion has not yet come out of it." Where Jesus will say to these scribes and Pharisees, "Hypocrites, you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And by virtue of that, you indeed prove that you are the descendants of those who murdered the very prophets. They have become the city of bloodshed," which is what Jesus is isolating here. And of course, there are no prophets other than John for them to condemn, and by virtue of that, enact the very thing that their ancestors were guilty for themselves. And here Jesus is saying they're guilty for, other than John the Baptist. But they don't get their hooks into him. That's Herod Antipas. Many of these people seemingly fear John, but they don't want to act on it because they're afraid of what the people might do. But when it comes to Jesus, they have had their fill of him, and the last straw has finally come in, and they recognize they're going to have to take action because Herod Antipas is not going to do to Jesus what he did to John. And so they feel themselves threatened, endangered, and they think the people are also threatened and endangered by him. So they take it upon themselves to do the very thing their ancestors did, of course, and to seize him and kill him. So all that to say, what we are seeing here in this particular chapter is, as I said here, a tentative particular or a potential lesson title could be "A Long and Painful Line of Rejection." Jesus is standing in the vein of all of these prophets who came before him or who were rejected in the same way he is being rejected, and who were either put to the sword or forced to, and I say put to the sword just as a euphemism of saying killed. They were killed in various different ways, or perhaps were allowed to live through it all like a Jeremiah was, but forced to endure terrible torture at the hands of the very people they're trying to minister to. And by virtue of that, faced rejection all the same through the kind of blasphemous words that were said against them as the Lord's prophets. So I hope this is helpful and in some way helps connect this for you. So more to come. Thanks for listening.